How ancient empires built the blueprint for Cold War superpowers, 5,000 years compressed. By 1962, when American spy planes caught the first photographs of Soviet missiles in Cuba, nobody was actually surprised by the shape of the crisis. The locations changed. The weapons changed. But the underlying pattern, two rival empires positioning themselves at opposite ends of a continent, each convinced the other represented an existential threat, that pattern had been running for 5,000 years. And here's the crucial part. The superpowers didn't invent this game. They inherited it. They inherited the mistakes, the geometry, the paranoia, the way empires collapse when they overreach. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see exactly which ancient mistakes the Cold War powers were destined to repeat, and which ones they managed to avoid. And that difference is what determined whether the world actually survived the 20th century. If you're watching this because you lived through these decades, you know the fear was genuine. And if you want to understand where that fear came from, not just the ideology, but the actual operational patterns that made both sides believe war was inevitable, leave a comment below and tell me which moment of the Cold War still stays with you. The ones that made you think we'd never actually make it. Here's something most people miss about Cold War history. Hold on, I need you to catch this before we go further. Our complete guide to the 5,000-year pattern, the actual mechanism of how empires collapse under the weight of their own geography, that's available in the description and pinned to the comments. It walks through the signals, the early warnings that both superpowers either saw and ignored or simply didn't understand. Not free content. This is the deep dive where the real story lives. The first thing to understand is that empires don't choose their shape by accident. Geography chooses it for them. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, around 550 BCE, covered nearly 2 million square miles. It stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. The distances were enormous. A message from the capital could take weeks to reach the frontier. Armies were stationed across multiple continents. And the moment that empire tried to defend every inch of that territory simultaneously, it became vulnerable to collapse. Rome learned the same lesson 8 centuries later. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was defending a frontier line that stretched over 4,000 miles. Britain to Mesopotamia. The cost of maintaining that perimeter, fortifications, garrisons, supply chains, eventually exhausted the treasury. Rome couldn't defend everywhere, so it had to choose: defend the Rhine or defend the Danube, defend North Africa or defend the eastern provinces. The more it chose, the less it could actually protect what it didn't choose. This is where the Cold War pattern becomes unmistakable. After 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States inherited the same geometric problem. Stalin controlled territory from Warsaw to Vladivostok. Nearly 5,000 miles of border. America's commitment stretched from Western Europe to Japan. The same continental reach, the same fortress mentality, the same calculation. If we don't defend this point, the enemy expands. If we defend everything, we bankrupt ourselves. The Romans solved this problem in only one way. They stopped trying. Around 410 AD, they pulled their legions out of Britain, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't afford the garrison anymore. The expense exceeded the strategic value. That decision made sense mathematically. Politically, it was a confession. It meant Rome was shrinking. America refused Rome's choice. Instead of withdrawing, American planners designed a system of forward bases: Germany, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, the Philippines. A perimeter of air bases and naval stations that ringed the Soviet Union like a noose. The cost was staggering. In 1950 alone, military spending consumed 7% of American GDP. By 1955, it had climbed to 13%. That money came from somewhere. It came from the decision to never stop building, never stop stationing troops, never acknowledge that the price might be unsustainable. Stalin faced the same arithmetic problem, and he solved it differently. Where America built bases, the Soviet Union built walls. When Yugoslavia's Tito broke with Moscow in 1948, Stalin could not recapture him militarily without risking war with America, so he sealed Yugoslavia's border instead. When Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia showed signs of drifting toward the west, Stalin did not negotiate. He tightened control. He installed secret police. He made defection impossible. The Iron Curtain was not a poetic metaphor. It was a practical solution to a military problem. If you cannot afford to hold territory by defending it against invasion, you hold it by making escape impossible. By 1950, both superpowers had committed to a vision of permanent confrontation, not temporary occupation, not negotiated spheres, permanent. American planners called this containment. The term came from diplomat George Kennan's 1946 analysis of Soviet behavior. Kennan argued that the Soviet system was inherently expansionist, that it would probe for weakness everywhere, and that the only response was to resist at every point where Soviet force met American interest. Containment became doctrine. It became law. But before you continue watching, I need you to think about something specific. This entire framework rested on one assumption, that the American economy could sustain indefinite military spending without transforming American society itself. That assumption would be tested within months, and if you want to understand the deeper mechanisms of how two empires compete when neither can afford to lose face, my guide on superpower competition goes into the economic pressure points and decision trees that shape this entire era. You'll find it in the description and the pinned comment. It explores exactly how empires choose between bankruptcy and defeat. The Korean War would test containment within months. In June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The invasion itself was not a surprise to American intelligence. What surprised Washington was that Stalin and Mao had approved it. Moscow and Beijing had calculated that Korea was outside America's defensive perimeter. Secretary of State Dean Acheson had said so publicly in January 1950. He drew a defensive perimeter that included Japan, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Korea was not on the list. Stalin read Acheson's speech and believed he had permission. He was wrong. President Truman, fearing that Soviet expansion would domino through Asia, committed American forces to Korea within days. General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander, pushed North Korean forces back to the Chinese border by October 1950. Then China entered the war. Mao sent 300,000 troops across the Yalu River. American forces recoiled. What followed was not victory. It was stalemate. For 3 years, American and Chinese forces fought over the same ridges and valleys, trading casualties for no territorial gain. American casualty figures reached 33,000 dead. Chinese casualties exceeded 400,000. South Korean civilian deaths reached 2 million. At the armistice line in 1953, the border looked almost identical to 1950. The point is this: containment required military action. But military action did not guarantee victory, and the cost of maintaining positions indefinitely was higher than anyone had anticipated. Korea taught American planners that holding the line required not just bases and troops, but the willingness to fight limited wars that would never produce total victory, wars that would drain resources, wars that would never end. This was the contradiction at the heart of containment. It demanded permanent forward presence. It demanded military readiness. It demanded the ability to respond instantly to Soviet moves anywhere on the globe. But it could never deliver the decisive victory that would end the confrontation. Stalemate became the price of survival, and that price would only increase. By 1953, the Korean armistice was signed. Not a peace treaty, an armistice. The fighting stopped, but technically the war never ended. American troops remained. Soviet advisors remained. The peninsula stayed divided at almost exactly the same line where the war had begun. Nothing was resolved. Everything was frozen. 50,000 American soldiers had died. Over 1 million Korean casualties, military and civilian combined. The Soviet Union had lost pilots, advisors, equipment. The Chinese had committed hundreds of thousands of troops and suffered catastrophic losses. And at the end of it all, Korea remained divided. The Korean War did not defeat communism in Asia. It demonstrated that the United States could not easily defeat it either. Eisenhower understood this immediately when he took office in January 1953. He had commanded the European theater in the Second World War. He knew the cost of large-scale conventional warfare. He also understood that if the United States committed to fighting a Korean-style war in every region where communism moved, the American economy would collapse under the weight of indefinite military spending. Before we continue, hold this thought tightly. Eisenhower's answer to this problem would reshape not just American military doctrine, but the entire structure of the Cold War itself. And if you want to understand the mechanisms driving his strategy, how he balanced budgets against threats, how nuclear weapons became a substitute for conventional forces, the full analysis is in our complete guide on Cold War military doctrine and doctrine shifts. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It goes far deeper into the decisions that determined how America would fight the next 30 years without economic collapse. His solution was called the New Look defense policy. The logic was stark. Instead of maintaining massive conventional forces and fighting land wars in distant theaters, the United States would rely on nuclear weapons as the primary deterrent, not as a last resort, as the first line of defense. This meant the American military could be smaller, the defense budget could be stabilized, and the threat of nuclear retaliation would keep the Soviets in check. Nuclear weapons had been available since 1945, but under Truman, the military had maintained large conventional forces alongside the nuclear arsenal. Under Eisenhower, nuclear weapons became the centerpiece. This was called massive retaliation. If the Soviets or their allies attacked American interests anywhere, the response would not necessarily be limited or conventional. It could be nuclear. The calculation was simple. No conventional war was worth a nuclear war, so the threat of going nuclear would prevent any attack that mattered. Eisenhower's Secretary of State John Foster Dulles articulated this doctrine clearly. Brinkmanship, the willingness to go to the edge of nuclear war, to move right up to the cliff without falling off. The Soviets would have to believe that America would actually use nuclear weapons. Only then would they hesitate before testing the system. The problem was Taiwan. After the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the nationalist government retreated to the island. The People's Republic, newly communist, threatened to invade and complete the unification of China. Eisenhower extended an implicit nuclear guarantee to Taiwan. If China invaded, the United States would respond. With what? That question was left deliberately vague. The ambiguity was the point. In 1954, and again in 1958, the People's Republic shelled small islands in the Taiwan Strait. Eisenhower moved nuclear-capable bombers closer to China. Threats escalated. Both sides backed down. The islands remained contested. Taiwan remained independent. The nuclear threat had worked, at least on the surface. Eisenhower called this strategy massive retaliation. The doctrine was simple in theory. Any Soviet or Chinese aggression, anywhere, risked nuclear war. The cost of conventional warfare had become unacceptable. Therefore, smaller conflicts would be deterred by the shadow of apocalypse. Fewer troops needed deployment. Fewer soldiers died in small wars. The budget shrunk. Nuclear weapons were cheaper than armies. Except they were not. The math looked good on paper, but the Soviets knew it too. They had the bomb now. They were building more. By 1955, they had tested a hydrogen bomb of their own. The monopoly was over. The guarantee evaporating changed everything. Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, began talking openly about Soviet power. The Soviets, he claimed, were producing missiles by the thousands. American cities would burn. This was propaganda, but it carried weight because some of it was true. The Soviets had built an intercontinental missile. They called it the R-7. In October 1957, they launched it into space carrying a satellite. That satellite was Sputnik. The world watched a metal sphere orbit Earth every 90 minutes. Americans woke up to it. Newspapers printed the news. Scientists were stunned. The implications were immediate and terrifying. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch a nuclear warhead to New York. The missile gap, the supposed Soviet lead in long-range missiles, became real in the American mind, whether or not it actually existed. Congress demanded action. The military demanded funding. Scientists demanded laboratories. Schools demanded better math and science education. An entire generation of American children was told that Soviet children were smarter, better trained, more disciplined. Competition became existential. This was education as Cold War. Before we continue, there is something crucial to understand here. The fear was real, but the facts were incomplete. Eisenhower knew this because American intelligence told him. U-2 spy planes, flying over Soviet territory since 1955, had photographed Soviet air bases and missile sites. The missile gap did not exist. The Soviets had far fewer intercontinental missiles than Americans believed. But Eisenhower could not share this secret. To admit that spy planes were flying over Soviet territory would be an act of war. To admit that there was no missile gap would terrify the American public and Congress even more. How could the President of the United States be so badly informed? How could he have allowed such a dangerous situation to develop? The lie, or rather the silence, was necessary. And if you want to understand why intelligence kept driving Cold War decisions, why presidents made choices that seemed paranoid but made perfect sense at the time, the deeper mechanisms are explained in my complete guide in the description and pinned comment. That guide walks through the classified documents and declassified analyses that finally show what each side actually knew versus what they feared. The space race became the public face of competition. Sputnik was Soviet. Explorer, the American response, followed in January 1958. Then the Soviets launched an even heavier satellite, carrying a dog. Then the Americans launched a monkey into space. Each milestone was a psychological victory or defeat. Millions watched. Schools celebrated or mourned. The race was real, but it was also symbolic. What mattered was not reaching the moon. That was years away, but proving that your system worked better, that your people were smarter, that your future was brighter. Eisenhower created NASA. Congress funded it heavily. Young men became astronauts. Engineers worked around the clock. The space program became a way to pursue military objectives, missile development, reconnaissance, under the cover of peaceful exploration. A rocket that could carry a nuclear warhead to Moscow could also carry a man to orbit. The technology was the same. The purpose was different only in name. Back on Earth, the arms race accelerated. The Soviets built submarines carrying missiles. Americans built submarines carrying more missiles. Both sides tested new warheads, each larger than the last. Above-ground testing filled the atmosphere with radioactive fallout. Children wore badges measuring radiation exposure. Milk was tested for contamination. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was in the rain, it was in the soil, it was settling in bones and teeth. Eisenhower, the military man who had fought in 2 wars, began to worry. In his farewell address, delivered in January 1961 as he left office, he warned Americans about the military-industrial complex. The phrase stuck. Weapons manufacturers, defense contractors, military officers, and politicians had interlocking interests. War was profitable. Peace was not. The system, he feared, had become self-perpetuating. Eisenhower died in 1969 without knowing if anyone had listened. The revelation I promised you at the beginning now arrives. Ancient Rome did not fall because of a single blow. It fractured under the weight of systems that could not sustain themselves. Empires invested everything into military dominance. They built walls, they stationed armies at every frontier. The cost of maintaining that apparatus, the salaries, the garrisons, the supply lines, eventually consumed the resources needed to feed the empire itself. The system ate itself from within. This was the blueprint. This was the exact pattern that began to trap the Cold War superpowers by 1961. The United States and the Soviet Union had each built machines of such enormous complexity that keeping them running became the primary goal. Not peace, not security, not human welfare, the machine itself. Eisenhower understood this. He had lived inside the military apparatus his entire adult life. He knew how it worked, he knew what it cost, and he knew that by 1961, the system had developed a gravity of its own. You could not simply turn it off. Too many people depended on it. Too many corporations profited from it. Too many politicians built their careers on it. The defense budget was not an expense to be minimized. It was an engine of economic growth. It employed millions. It funded research. It built cities. Kennedy inherited this machine in January 1961. He was 43 years old. He believed he could manage it. He believed he could negotiate with Khrushchev. He believed that reason and intelligence could prevent nuclear war. What he discovered over the next 13 months would teach him something different. In October 1962, American spy planes photographed Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy had promised during his campaign that he would not tolerate Soviet weapons in the Western Hemisphere. Now the promise was being tested. The National Security Council met. The military Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended immediate airstrikes, remove the missiles by force, accept the risk of war. Kennedy chose a different path. A naval blockade. A quarantine, he called it. because a blockade was technically an act of war. American ships would encircle Cuba. Soviet ships would be turned back. It was a test of will without shooting. For 13 days, the world sat on the edge of nuclear conflict. Soviet submarines lurked beneath the Atlantic, armed with nuclear torpedoes. American destroyers hunted them. One mistake, one miscalculation, one captain acting without authorization could trigger the final war. Khrushchev blinked. The Soviet ships turned around. The missiles were withdrawn. The crisis passed. But the machine was not weakened by this near catastrophe. It was strengthened. The crisis had proven that nuclear deterrence worked. The threat of mutual destruction had prevented war. Therefore, both superpowers needed more weapons, more missiles, more submarines, to ensure that deterrence remained credible. That was the logic. That was how the system fed itself. By 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed a limited test ban treaty. It was a small gesture toward sanity. Above-ground nuclear testing would stop. The atmospheric radiation would gradually decline. Children's milk would become safe again. But underground testing continued. Weapons development accelerated. The arms race did not slow. It simply became invisible. This is the secret that explains the entire Cold War. The superpowers never actually fought each other, but they never stopped preparing for that fight. Every dollar spent on weapons was a dollar not spent on housing, on education, on infrastructure. Every brilliant scientist recruited into weapons research was a scientist not developing medicine or agriculture. Every acre used for military bases was an acre not available for families to build homes. The empires had chosen the path that Rome had chosen. Total mobilization for total war. Perpetual readiness. Perpetual expense. A system that justified itself by its own existence. Kennedy did not live to see the full consequences. An assassin's bullet in Dallas in November 1963 ended his presidency. Lyndon Johnson inherited the machine, and he too would discover that you cannot simply choose not to use it. The takeaway is this: empires do not collapse from a single defeat. They exhaust themselves maintaining the apparatus of power. The Cold War was not primarily a conflict between ideologies, though it wore that mask. It was a conflict between two military-industrial systems, each requiring an enemy to justify its existence. Remove the enemy, and the system would have to justify itself in other ways. That was unthinkable. Therefore, the enemy would never be removed. The machine would run until something broke it from the outside. And what broke the Cold War was not military victory. It was economic exhaustion. Consider this. The Soviet Union collapsed, not because it lost a war. It collapsed because it could no longer afford the system that had been built to wage that war. That is the conclusion of this story. And perhaps the practical challenge for you is this. Look at the institutions in your own time that claim they exist to protect you, to defend against threats, to keep you safe. Ask yourself whether they have become ends in themselves. That question matters more than you might think. Thank you for watching this entire journey through 5,000 years of empire and 45 years of Cold War tension. If this history has clarity for you, please subscribe to Cold War Clarity so you never miss our next episode. Leave a comment below and let me know which moment in this timeline changed your understanding of how these superpowers came to dominate the modern world. Hit the notification bell, and I'll see you next time.